welcome and thank you all for coming today. We're really excited about being able to do this at our college. The climate crisis obviously is the most paramount issue facing the future of Generation Z and those who are coming after Gen Z, my own children. And we're really lucky in the college environment to be able to kind of exist with these ideas around us all of the time. And today we get to really dive in, lean into those ideas, and hear from some experts and some professionals and some government officials who work within these communities, work within the climate change, the conversation of climate change to try to find solutions that help lead us our way towards a better future, we hope. So if Tim, if you wouldn't mind just sharing the screen real quick. I wanted to read, just to set the tone for today, I wanted to read a quote from the Marrow Thieves, which is the One Book, One College selection for this year. The Marrow Thieves dives into how climate change affects the most vulnerable communities. And in the case of the Marrow Thieves, it really dives into the Canadian tribes that live there as one of the people who are at the forefront of the climate crisis. And we're just kind of getting more people wandering in now, so come on in. Okay, just one moment. So Tim, would you mind just scrolling up a little bit so that we can see the quote? If you just move up, it should come up. Hi, everybody. Hold on just a moment, I'll go grab my notes. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read a quote from the Marrow Thieves just to set the tone. Cherie Demoline writes in her book describing a dystopian future, that looks very possible for all of us. She writes, the earth was broken. Too much taking for too damn long, so she finally broke. But she went out like a wild horse, bucking off as much as she could before lying down. A melting north meant the water levels rose, and the water changed, and the weather changed. It changed to violence in some cases, building tsunamis, spinning tornadoes, crumbling earthquakes, and the shapes of countries were changed forever. Whole coasts breaking off like crust. So even though The Marrow Thieves is a science fiction novel, we are faced now with sort of this existential crisis that this might happen to us. And it's looking more and more possible. So my own students who are here with me today have been diving into these ideas through their research. And we're really excited to explore some of the ways that we can make more of our communities, especially those that are most vulnerable, more resilient. So next to me here is Tristan, Tristan Wilkerson. Tristan Wilkerson is a former ASB president here at BBC. And right now he's double majoring in urban policy and in biology. And he's going to go to med school when, like next year? Yeah, just about next year. So he's going to start us off, and he's going to be helping to facilitate today. He's going to start us off with a traditional welcome and just talk a little bit about his own community. And then we'll go ahead and hear from our experts.
How's it going, everybody? I'm just going to start off with an introduction in my native language. Natasuis nopoaiui natuquas, nutomas masipia kutnatai ingoda. And basically, that means I am called Morning Wolf. my blood and bones are from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and I'm currently living in Inglewood. Um, there's a quote that goes, I'm gonna butcher it a little bit, but basically, we are a thread in the web of life, and what we do to the web of life, we do unto ourselves. And so it's always good to be mindful of that sacred balance. As like I said, I'm from the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, the people of the first light. We're in southeastern Massachusetts, and you know, let's move forward in good spirits and have speak truth, words of inspiration and encouragement. Thank you all for being here.
Okay, so first we're going to hear from Angie Hacker. Angie is someone I've actually known for a really long time. And I, even, even when she was a child, Angie was very concerned about lots of existential questions in the future of, where we were going. And it's been so exciting for me as her friend to watch her essentially take this issue in hand and to really be at the forefront of initiatives that help us lead the way into this climate crisis. So Angie is the principal consultant and CEO of Prosper Sustainably, which is a California-based firm. She's also worked for the County of Santa Barbara, helping to build new initiatives for that county in terms of like solar energy. So her current nonprofit experience serves communities in the area of sustainability, clean energy, and climate resilience. And especially she helps at the local level to make sure that people can, well, Angie, do you want to kind of take over and talk about more what you do? Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Well, yeah, my neuroses has found a good home in the concept of climate change, I suppose. You all can see my screen, right? Okay. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks to Jamie. Yeah, we've known each other since 4th grade. I also want to say thanks to VVC for inviting us to speak on a really important topic, near and dear to my heart, and especially important because November is obviously Native American Heritage Month, and I'm glad folks are taking the time to learn a little bit more. I'm first up here to tell you a little bit about what I do to support Native American communities who are facing a range of significant impacts as a result of climate change. And so that's what my role will be. And then the others will follow along with their own experiences and knowledge of what's going on with Native Americans and climate change. Just quickly about me. So Angie Hacker, and I have been serving communities in the area of climate change, energy, and sustainability for about 28 years, both inside and outside of government, and now as a consultant with Prosper Sustainably. Actually, my first experience working with tribes was about 12 years ago when I was running sustainability programs for the County of Santa Barbara and met Josh Simmons, who you're going to hear from later on. He worked for the local San Ynez Chumash tribe, and after a bunch of years of working together as friends, so full disclosure, we eventually married and we started a business together. So we know each other pretty well. As a consultant, I primarily work with local and tribal communities, and one of my favorite roles is as the lead consultant on a program that's federally funded and nationwide that's called the Tribal Climate Health Project, and that is actually led by Shasta, who you're going to hear from in a bit. And Shasta's with the Paula Band of Mission Indians down in the San Diego area. And that program helps to prepare tribes for the health impacts of climate change. And so it's kind of where I'm coming at it from. So for the last 5 years, we've been busily compiling and developing resources and expertise to make it easier for tribal serving professionals to protect the health and well-being of their community in the face of climate change. And we've reached over 1,000 tribal serving professionals to date. So I want to start from the top here and just assume that not everybody lives and breathes climate change like I do, but it's a big deal. Life on Earth depends on and is shaped by and affects climate change. So what is climate change? It's not just weather. It refers to long-term changes in usual or expected weather patterns driven by changes in the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases like CO2. And CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have increased more than 40% since pre-industrial times. And we've hit a new milestone. We're above 410 parts per million of CO2. That's a lot. It's more than the Earth has had in the atmosphere for millions of years. So we're in new territory. The world has already warmed 2 degrees since pre-industrial times. And you might be seeing in the news the COP26 meeting happening in Scotland. That's a bunch of international folks getting together, deciding that they really need to try to lower global emissions to limit the future warming to under 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. So you keep hearing 1.5, that's Celsius. 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit is where they're trying to limit things, because they know that the consequences cascading consequences are going to be far worse if we go beyond that point. And so, it used to be that we just thought, oh, this is, we saw polar bears floating around on ice and we thought that's bad news, but maybe not for us. But it is bad news, not just for the environment, but for us. Climate change will affect almost everything we care about. And for me, the rubber really hits the road when climate change conditions come into contact with the systems that support human health and well-being. And you're starting to see some really bold statements happening. Out of the Lancet, they say climate change is the biggest public health threat of the 21st century. There was another journal article recently that said a stable climate is the most fundamental determinant of human health. So above poverty, above violence, above COVID, having a stable climate is the most fundamental determinant of human health. So when we talk about health, though, we're not just talking about Western medicine, which might look like illness, morbidity, mortality, especially for tribes who like to look at health and well-being more holistically. And they have a long legacy of respecting and stewarding the environment and considering impacts to future generations. And tribes will often relay to us that the balance and harmony of people and the environment is slipping away. Now, had the settlers, of Western civilization lived with better balance, maybe we could have avoided such consequences. But fortunately, the latest things that I'm hearing is that a lot of folks who think the folks that assume that global warming is happening now outnumbers those who don't by 6 to 1. So there's hope. So what does it all mean? What do those concentrations mean? So the GHG emissions, they turn into the greenhouse effect that creates climate changes, and those have an effect those create exposures. And so there's this cascading effect of climate change. And the Tribal Climate Health Project, we have this framework. We talk about 5 key exposures: temperature extremes, wildfire, storms and flooding, drought, melting ice, and sea level rise. So those are the main climate changes that we're seeing happening in throughout the country, but in different ways. Those have secondary exposures that they trigger impacts to worsened air quality, vector changes, water insecurity, and food insecurity. And we'll talk a little bit more about what does that look like. All of that stuff will have an effect on communities and the things they care about, like their natural environment, their built environment, and their health and social environment. And working really closely with our advisory group and lots of tribes around the country, we tried really hard to define health in a way that resonated with tribes. And so we're not just talking about the human health aspect, but cultural and spiritual health, socioeconomic health, and then the big other concept is that all of these things are interrelated, that if there's lack of health, if there's lack of balance in the natural environment and in the built environment, eventually these things land in human health effects. And so climate change looks different across the country. It changes lives differently in different places. So, in the Pacific Northwest, the tribes that we learn about and talk with, they talk a lot about their fish, impacts to their fish, their food, and their forests, along with Great Lakes tribes. We also, we look to Alaska. A lot of tribes up there having there's a doubling of warming happening in Alaska. So a lot of the impacts we're seeing there are more significant even than down in the lower 48. but they see thawing, erosion, and impacts to their traditional hunting practices. The Navajo are relaying impacts related to heat and water insecurity. The Mojave has experienced a shrinking river, which has impacts on its spiritual practices. Down in the southeast, we see hurricanes and sea level rise. And in the middle of the country, in North Dakota, things like bomb cyclones and heavy flooding. And these, this is a very simplified version of what's going on, but I just want to give you a taste of how this is sort of presenting itself in different places. And actually, before I move on, I just want to mention that tribes are a significant piece of the population and that they protect, manage, and restore over 110,000 square miles in the US. And so part of what we've learned is that tribes define health more broadly and holistically than just the absence of medical disease. So when we talk about climate impacts, we're talking about impacts to physical health, which, yeah, might look like injury, death, undernutrition, limited access to to health services, but also impacts to mental health, trauma, grief, conflict. Impacts to socioeconomic health might look like cost of the damages that are incurred and having to be absorbed by communities that already have, some socioeconomic disparity. And things like lost work days or lost school days. And then cultural and spiritual health. That might look like something extreme, like a community might get completely displaced out of its native lands, or disrupted cultural practices. But again, this is a overview and a simplified version. But tribes very well understand that their health is interconnected with their lands and their natural environment. Another thing we learned is that the volume of impacts that are coming to all of our way, and in particular vulnerable and frontline communities like tribes, is overwhelming. And so this is like a tiny fraction of a couple of impacts that we look at. Like this one up here in the upper left says, this is areas vulnerable to predicted surface smoke from wildfires. And so we're looking down in the San Diego area, but just folks that are going to be inundated by smoke potentially have respiratory illness. Up here, we're looking at the number of people within a FEMA designated flood hazard area. So all the people at risk of flood. This section here is talking about heat related mortality and the expected dramatic increase in heat related mortality, which means deaths. Down below here, changes in Lyme disease. So the breeding patterns associated with the weather changes and the climate changes are creating an additional distribution of ticks, which carry disease like Lyme. To something else very different, which is food security and projected changes in national crop yields. So the food that we rely upon in the global food system and locally, it's all potentially changing. So not only are tribes disproportionately vulnerable, but they're disproportionately resilient. They've demonstrated their resilience over thousands of years that continue to remain. And we saw this during COVID, but things like, we can't blame everything on climate change. Some of the impacts, especially to Native American communities, some of the struggles are due to other man-made problems like water diversions and political conflicts. And, during COVID, we saw that despite being only about 2% of the population, Indigenous communities were 3.5% more likely to contract COVID. And we looked to things like historical oppression and broken treaty promises and century of neglect, health, racial, social, and economic inequalities that lead to more disparate outcomes. I gotta get this poll out of my way. All right. So I want to just dive, and you're going to hear examples from the folks that are here from tribes. I'm so excited to hear from them. But here's one. So this is the Bishop Paiute tribe in Central Eastern California. They have a couple of creeks that flow through the reservation from the eastern, that should be Sierra Nevada mountains. And I just want to emphasize this like interrelationship between man-made changes that are not always climate change. And so back in the early 1900s, it was Los Angeles that started pumping water out of Owens Valley. And those changes to their groundwater and their water security have already been in play for over a century. And they've intensified now with climate change exposures like drought. There's less snowpack happening up in those mountains. The streams are drying earlier and the springs are disappearing. The stream temperatures are increasing. Changes to native and invasive fish populations and bacteria and algae are increasing. They see things like beetle infestation, which is causing the trees to die off. And then their acorns and their pine nuts that are culturally important foods are disappearing. And all that increases the wildfire danger. And so elevated because the grasses are now growing rapidly, and then they dry out and become fuel. And all of that becomes a health issue for a lot of reasons, including an increased level of PM10, which is a particulate, an air quality issue. So I'm just going to end here by saying the really good news is that tribes are adapting. Despite limited capacity, despite a lot of institutional barriers, they are beginning, they have begun to actually lead the way in some really important ways to adapt their communities. So for example, sadly, places like Ile de Jean, Charles Band of Biloxi, Chickamauga, Choctaw Indians down in Southeast are actually becoming displaced. So that's not a way that we'd love to see them be adapting, but they're actually having to move away from their native lands and their rights. Same thing's happening to some communities in Alaska. So adaptation sometimes looks like relocation, and it threatens the loss of culture and sovereignty. But then you've got other folks like the Rincon Band in San Diego building a fire station, microgrid to help save, with help from some state grant dollars. A tribe in New Mexico is constructing hoop houses and greenhouses to protect its produce from climate extremes and putting solar systems at its fish hatchery to protect its food system. So we're looking at all sorts of interesting ways that tribes are trying to manage these changes. I'll go through this just to say, a lot of what I do, I work with communities on the ground too, across the country on actually building out their adaptation plans. And it's a lot of work. And I guess last message I want to leave you with is that there are a lot of folks that are interested in helping supporting tribes better. You're seeing some of that interest come out of the White House. They have just released a press release and a policy to elevate Indigenous knowledge in federal policy decisions, which is super cool. And then us at the Tribal Climate Health Project, we have this vast national network of people that really want to help tribes get through this process of completing their vulnerability assessments and doing adaptation planning, all this work that gets done just to help them address the risks that are coming their way. So, and then I leave you with the question, which is, what will you do?
Okay, thank you so much, Angie. So that was a lot, right? That was a lot of information. And I think one of the things that's highlighted in that presentation that Angie just gave us is this is a big problem, right? With lots of different tenets and aspects that need to be looked at in order for us to solve it. Something I would like to point out is that overwhelmingly Generation Z students and college students are choosing careers in sustainability because they do see this as one of the biggest fields and the most important fields, and to them, there's nothing else that's more important. So what you saw, I hope, from what Angie just demonstrated was that there are so many different ways to get involved in this issue. So being thoughtful about how you can get involved and take on this problem yourself in whatever career that you choose, I think is really important, right? So thank you, Angie. I wanted to point out also that our question and answer is available to you. So you're welcome to type questions in there, and either our panelists will answer those questions through the chat function, or we'll save some of those questions for later in the webinar, and Tristan and I will ask the panelists those questions then. So please feel free to open to use the Q&A, and that's for faculty. If you're on right now as well as students, please feel free to use the Q&A. Okay, so next up is Mark Villasenor, and Mark is an active and determined member of his community, both culturally and politically. He is the descent. Well, I'm going to let you explain that part, Mark. He's the current tribal vice president for his tribe, and he collaborates with federal, state, and local municipalities, as well as other sovereign nations in efforts to better his tribe. And I looked up a little bit about all of our panelists, and Mark has been very involved in social justice issues for his tribe and moving his tribe forward. So here to talk a little bit about stewardship and the experiences of the Los Angeles Native people is Mark Villasenor.
Thank you for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. And like I was introduced, I'm Mark Visner. I'm the for Indian Sovereign Band of Mission Indians, Tribal Vice President. And I just want to describe a little bit about my history and my people. My tribe is a coalition of 26 villages throughout the San Fernando, Santa Cruz, and Antelope Valleys and parts of Simi Valley within northern Los Angeles County. Today, of those 26 villages, we know as lineages, meaning families descend from each one of those independent villages. And out of the 26 today, 3 exist within the tribe today due to, cultural genocide and moving outside of the territories and boundaries. So I'm one of the existing surviving lineages. And I just wanted to show you really quick a map that we have of our tribal area, just to show. Can everyone see the map? So this is the geographical overlay of our traditional homelands, and our villages are in red in those locations. The little horseshoe areas are the land grants that my tribe had received during the Mexican period. And I point this out because each one of these horseshoe land grants that we had received had water resources on them, which is a very integral part when it comes to Los Angeles County, especially the northern half, is that you can see some lakes in the top here, but around the San Fernando area, going along down this area, they were tributaries that fed the LA River. So pretty much the LA River was concreted over, and pretty much a lot of the water has been kind of destroyed, which is a fundamental issue amongst our people, because when we're trying to figure out climate change and man-made effects of it, we don't have to go that far to see the man-made effects of climate change within our own tribal areas, because we've lived it. They've dammed up the northern tributary into the LA River. And so now all the water that used to come through that section of the valley no longer exists. It is let out in parcel, but so that means all the traditional vegetation, land, and animals that had used that for its purposes have now disappeared, which has greatly and drastically affected the area. So a lot of the area has become drier, it's become hotter, the weather has become more dusty, being more particulate, harder to breathe. And not to mention, it also pushed the animals further out. So since the deer population is not what it once was, you have a lot of the bushes being a lot larger than they should normally. And then, to tackle that on as well, we don't practice cultural burning. I think that's a big thing that people from the native perspective try to educate those outside of it, is that cultural burning was a huge part of our climate conservation and keeping everything in its place where it should be, because the cultural burning actually renewed the forest and kept some of these bushes from starving out the trees, which actually thinned out a lot of the invasive, not the invasive, but the larger plant habitats that kind of took root and took over. I think a lot of it hasn't been enough issue on cultural burning. And I know there's been a big movement within California to restart doing those cultural burning aspects, because the wildfires we have today are bigger and a lot more severe than they've ever been. And that is mainly because the tribes knew how to forest manage, because for us, we were masters of our home. We're masters of the environment. We knew how to protect it, how to take care of it, how to manage it. Because from our point of view, us and the environment are kind of one and the same, because we need it as much as it needs us. It needs us to manage the forest. It needs us to manage the animal populations. It needs us to manage that interaction between the two. And when one side goes too far to the other, it never ends well. And with the destruction of kind of our traditional areas in terms of our natural resources and the climate. We've seen here hotter, drier areas in recent years. Of course, that's impacted by global climate change, but I think from our perspective, we're always trying to educate on how we can bring ourselves back into some semblance of balance. But then again, we also have to adapt into the new ever-changing global climate structure that we have here in northern Los Angeles County. So it's been tough, but I think, you know, with that, I think I'm good there. And then if there's any questions, we can also I can address those a little later.
Okay, Mark, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being here. I'm going to cut the introduction shorter so that we can get to more of the panelists. So next up is Shasta Gohan, and I hope I pronounced that correctly, Shasta.
Nope, but I'll correct you.
Okay, good. Good, thank you. And Shasta is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pala Band of Mission Indians. And so she's going to go ahead and talk a little bit for us now.
Thank you so much. And I'm Shasta Gohan. I am, as introduced, the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and also the Environmental Director for the Pala Band of Mission Indians. And I am coming to you today from Payam-Kawachum, or Luiseno territory in northern San Diego County. I am not Indigenous myself, but I have worked for Pala for 17 years now. And I'm not going to go into too much detail because I think Angie gave you a good overview of the climate effects that we're working on in the Tribal Climate Health Project. But I do want to give a little bit of perspective on some of the things that Mark said about the perspective of tribes on climate change. And it's not going to be exactly the same as what people normally think of when they think of climate change. And so that's what I am going to briefly share with you here. What do we think of when we think of climate change? People think melting ice. They think sea level rise. They think extreme weather events. They think drought, especially here in Southern California. They think extreme heat, and they think of wildfire. So these are the environmental effects of climate change. And of course, those have an effect on individuals, on people, on plants, on animals, on the air, on the water. But when it comes to tribes and so-called tribal cultural resources, climate change has an effect on these things too. But I want to just interrogate a little bit this idea of what is a tribal cultural resource. And just like people have this idea of what we mean by climate change, when they think of a tribal resource, they tend to think archaeologically. So they think of a village site or ancient ruins, rock art, pottery, or arrowheads, projectile points. But for tribes, those are tangible resources. And those effects are not just on things like archaeological sites, they're also on things like hunting areas. So for Alaska Native villages who are used to being able to go on thick ice to do ice fishing or to hunt sea mammals, they are losing hunting areas because of climate change. They're having to relocate their village in many cases away from places of abrupt sea level rise or because of coastal erosion. And so this is an Alaska village of Newtok that is being relocated because of sea level rise. Extreme weather events can mean cancellation of ceremonies, or alternatively, if the weather is not coming the way that we're used to as far as things like a first snow. I have a friend whose community, she's Dene or Navajo, they welcome the first snowfall of the year. They wash their face in the snow, and that ceremony is happening later and later, or sometimes not at all, because the snow isn't coming anymore. Drought has impacts on things like traditional farming. The Hopi do dry farming where they would plant a kernel of corn just 12 inches below the surface so that it can access the moisture that's below the soil. But now 12 inches isn't deep enough. You have to go 24 inches or more. And that's so deep that the plant never makes it to the surface. So that's another climate impact. The effects of heat, as we know, not just on people, but on things like traditional species. Can those plants and animals that you depend on, whether it's for food or medicine or ceremony, still be accessed if the landscape is now so hot that those species don't thrive in those places anymore? And of course, fire destroys so many things, but it destroys gathering areas, or it can destroy access to ceremonial sites. So those are the tangible effects that tribes are thinking about over and above the sort of typical things that people think about with climate change. And then there's those really important intangible effects. If you can no longer gather that traditional food that you are used to having for your ceremonies, special occasions, what does that mean for your identity? I have friends who are Yurok and Hupa and Tolowa, or friends who are from tribes in the Great Lakes, the Anishinaabe peoples. And I've heard them ask that question, who am I? If I have to leave my ancestral lands because of climate change, or what does it mean if I can no longer gather my foods? What are my values and how do I reinforce them if climate change has changed the landscape so much that I can't do my first snow face washing every year because the climate has changed and now we no longer have access to that ceremony that reinforces who we are as a people? And our traditions. What happens to traditions if you can't hunt and gather the wild rice, the salmon, those special medicines that are important at certain times of year? Those are the intangible effects. And Angie and I are trying to address those in the Tribal Climate Health Project as well, because those end up having a significant impact on emotional and social and cultural well-being. And people don't tend to think about that, but let me just put it into kind of Western terms. It's not unusual to be depressed about climate change. And so we're trying to help manage some of those effects as well. So just briefly, these are the key points that I just went over. This climate change is a threat to cultures, identities, and values. It doesn't just threaten the environment. And tribal cultural heritage is not just archaeological sites or ancient villages or ruins. There are things that we can't touch that are part of tribal cultural heritage. And finally, if we're going to safeguard that heritage, we have to acknowledge that there are intangible effects and not just physical effects on the environment. So I'm going to leave it at that and toss it over to Josh to wrap things up on the panel side.
Thank you, Shasta. Yeah, so Josh is going to go ahead and talk. Josh is the founder of Prosper Sustainably, and he served as an environmental director for the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. So go ahead, Josh.
Great, thanks, Jamie, and thanks everybody for being here today. I really appreciate it. Appreciate the different perspectives, and just happy to be in this environment where hopefully there's a lot more momentum in seeking to address these issues that are facing really all of us. I first got involved in the Native American communities on environmental issues back as a high school senior in 1999. I'm from Connecticut and worked with the Mohegan tribe. And at that time, I can't say that I really understood Native American communities that well. It wasn't probably until I got to law school, went to University of San Diego and studied federal land law, and Native American communities came up and environmental issues, and started to really just understand the tip of the iceberg about what is a tribal community, what that means, what does sovereignty mean, what are different land statuses, what are the different statuses of the different tribes. And it's a complex world. It also means that what I learned and took away from it, and what kind of drove me forward through my career, is that Native American communities are, including those that have what's called federal recognition status and federal lands, they have different laws and things that apply, and different resources to address the impacts on their community from things like climate change, but environmentally. So, I saw that as an area of need and something that I really was driven to continue to pursue my career to work on. And ultimately, in graduate school at UCSB, ended up working with the Santa Ynez Chumash, eventually became their environmental director. And after doing that for 7 years, I founded Prosper Sustainably, and working on tribes in a variety of areas. I worked some with Shasta and Angie on the Tribal Climate Health Project. I do get involved in kind of planning and studies and stuff involving climate change type projects. But I'm want to share with you about kind of the specific projects I'm working on, which are really in the realm of implementation and dealing with some very tangible impacts I think we're all experiencing right now. If you live in California, you have experienced anywhere in California, you've experienced the impacts of wildfires, one way or another. I think last year, the entire state was covered with ash for a good period of time. And I've been doing more and more work on tribal microgrid projects, and tribes are typically haven't been granted, those that have federal recognition status were granted lands, tend to have been granted lands out in rural areas, less desirable areas, oftentimes, and those areas are more heavily impacted by climate change. They're more arid, they're more rural, they're more threatened by heat, more threatened by wildfires. And so they're among the communities in California that are now, when the threat of wildfires occurs, the heat rises, the winds start to pick up. The utilities are shutting down sections of the grid to avoid sparks creating wildfires, and it's shutting down entire communities, not just tribal communities, communities all throughout the state, but the image you see behind me is San Pasqual Band of Mission Indians. They've experienced outages for their community that have extended for days or more. Tribes up north in particular, you've heard of probably some of the wildfire impacts going on up there. They've experienced outages for weeks. So they are impacted, like their community health is impacted, their livelihood is impacted, their basic services are impacted. I mean, think about living in a rural community and you have very limited access to food and fuel and water and even air conditioning. I mean, so if you don't have a generator, or you have a generator that has only a day worth of fuel, after a day, if you're in a public safety power shutoff event that's lasting weeks, you don't have power. You may be losing access to fuel. If you have medical issues, then your life may be almost immediately threatened by that. So I'll kind of I'll share my screen and show a few of the projects that I'm working on right now. And so this is actually a conceptual design of the San Pasqual microgrid project. This is kind of the government campus. And in pursuing these projects, the tribes that I'm working with have prioritized renewable energy. They not only want to help adapt and create greater resilience against the impacts of climate change that are having very real, ongoing, and increasing impacts to their community, but they also want to be a part of the solution in mitigating the impacts of climate change by, when they're installing things like these renewable energy microgrid systems, having them be powered by clean energy sources such as solar, having them use energy storage instead of relying upon backup generators. So this particular microgrid does have some backup generators, but as a last resort is primarily powered by a solar and lithium ion. And these are complex projects. This is a new and emerging field. And for me, I enjoy working with tribes. I enjoy working with them, helping them in their whole community. I mean, that's one thing I find that I really particularly enjoy about working with tribal communities is the ability to be working with the community, have a sense of community, and working from helping people in their homes and where they live, to the government services that they're relying upon that tend to be very centralized and very much people actually go to the centers of their communities. I don't really feel like outside of tribal communities you see that much anymore. And they're also involved in their businesses as well. So that background you've seen is this microgrid is almost going to be fully operational, and probably by the end of December. And there's a picture of the solar that was installed. I'm working on an extremely complex and cutting-edge microgrid system for the Rincon Band of Luis Sueño Indians, and both these tribes, as well as Paula, are both all located in Northeast San Diego County, rural area impacted by this public safety power shutoffs and wildfire events. And so in this case, we're talking about a much larger microgrid system serving a variety of critical facilities, involving new forms of energy storage that hopefully will be one of the first of its kind in the world. And in serving the community, I also get to work with engineers and others as well. So it's an exciting project to work on. and then another the Rincon Government Center microgrid project. Angie mentioned the fire station, and then we'll be working with Shasta and the Apollo community on bringing resilient energy systems to keep their community up and running when the power is going out. So another thing that we're working on as well, Shasta, Angie, and I, we're working with the state, with trying to work with the state in helping understand how tribes can better, how the state can help tribes better address their needs and priorities in pursuing clean energy and addressing climate change impacts. And so that's something where we've been reaching out to all the tribes through a questionnaire. We're developing a report. We'll be making recommendations to the state that hopefully will result in more resources for tribes to better address the impacts of climate change. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Thanks, guys. That was really great information. I know for a fact that my students are working on projects right now that I hope that a lot of that information would be really helpful for. I'm going to give it over to Tristan in just a moment to ask some of the student questions, but I just wanted to acknowledge that thank you, Shasta, for bringing up the sort of emotional impact of learning about climate change and its real effects, that the effects that they're having now. I know for a fact that in my classes with my students, there's been a lot of kind of deep emotional reaction to understanding. There's been anger that generations before them didn't do something about this. And sometimes I'm not sure how to leave the classroom with them feeling, more resilient or more hopeful about the future. So I just was wondering if you guys could expand a little bit on that and maybe give us something to grapple with in terms of our own emotional reaction or how we can cope with it ourselves emotionally.
Well, I wish there was an easy answer. And I will tell you that I think about other people's children as a way to try to propel me and give me hope. I don't have kids of my own. I have cats and chickens, and unless I'm very unlucky, I'm pretty sure I'm going to outlive them. But I think about Josh and Angie's kids. I taught at Cal State San Marcos for 14 years, so I think about my undergrads. And what gives me hope now is the fact that even though, previous generations, my age and my parents' age seem like they haven't done much, I don't think we can blame any one particular generation. And I think that we should take hope from the fact that we are finally starting to get things done. Human beings have a very, very difficult time thinking beyond next year, much less beyond their own lifespan. But I think we're finally starting to get to that point. And I will say that as a non-Indigenous person working with Indigenous communities, the long-range views and the ways that Native communities tend to think about time has been very hopeful to me. They have hope for the future, and that gives me hope for the future.
Maybe I'll just mention that Dr. Douglas Walker is one of the experts we work with the Tribal Climate Health Project, and he is a mental health expert, but he works on something called psychosocial resilience. And one of the big things that he has done so much work and research around communities, including tribes, recovering from disasters. And he has summed up his key conclusion is the best thing we can all do is get to know our neighbor. And so the element of connection with people in real, authentic ways and in dialogue that goes beyond the surface, so we can help each other when it matters, is going to go a long way.
And then Tim, can I just ask you to put up the Q&A questions for us so that we can see some of those for our... And then I'm just curious too, Mark, if you wanted to maybe talk a little bit about how your tribe deals with the emotional impact of the climate crisis, because I imagine that for you it would be very different, different sense of anger.
Yeah, it's very different for us. For us, we in this area that we call home, the land grants that we had received were for thousands and thousands of acres of land here in this area for our people. And with the destruction of the climate and the the damming up of the rivers and, the changing of the landscape, it's been very hard for our people to do our traditional water practices because it doesn't really exist. And then again, we don't have access to it because a lot of these rivers were turned into storm drains. So we're not exactly using that water for the purposes of, naming ceremonies and birthing practices. So a lot of the destruction of our natural resources here in this area has fundamentally to change the way we do our practices and even just the preservation of those practices, which has decreased over time because of said destruction. I think that's probably the biggest issue that we have in destruction with our natural climate here.
Thank you. Here, let me actually see this. Okay, and then Mark, another question that we have is about the controlled burning. So explained as cultural burning. So you explained it as cultural burning, no longer being implemented to control the issue. Is it no longer being implemented to control the issue of overgrowth that often leads to massive fires?
Well, there's been a more of an attempt to do that pre-burning to combat the wildfires here within the state of California. I know there's many tribes up north, and they just had some of the first starting cultural burns down here. It's very important to understand, because I wrote a response here that, a lot of people think preservation and conservation means hands off. I mean, that's kind of the biggest misnomer for our people who, we're masters of our environment. We understood that there's a balance, and you can't leave something to be alone, or otherwise it develops in a way that's not healthy. We view the forest as having to be healthy just like us. So in order to keep them healthy, we also have to do burns at times. In other words, to revitalize the forest and allow the populations that need to grow back, because, oaks can become fire resistant from being exposed to wildfires. They can do that, but they have to be exposed to that fire. But if they're not, and a fire runs through and burns all the oak dead, then it's never going to recover. But if they're able to survive a lower kind of severity wildfire, the next time around, they're not going to burn as easy. And it takes years for this to happen. It takes a while for the trees to adapt. And these are things that we know and other tribes have known, but only now has this practice started to be implemented because the massive fires that we have right now.
Thank you. I just can't see the Q&A questions to ask. Sorry, Tim, thanks.
So we have a nice, brilliant army of students here, and there's going to be more students wave after wave watching this webinar. And so, while we have these panelists here, I just wanted to ask you guys if you can give them some takeaways in terms of activism on what can they do tomorrow, next week. How can they shape their their majors to really make differences in their communities wherever they are, wherever their life leads them. What concrete steps can they take to move forward in combating the climate crisis? Because as we know, the future generations hold the greatest stake in this battle. And so what can we do to assist and carry on the mission that you guys have dedicated so much of your time and lives to?
I'm always happy to jump in, but I've already spoken, so I don't know if anybody else wants to try that one first. Josh, was that a flap of the hand as in Shasta, go ahead?
It was a go ahead, Shasta.
Okay, I will go ahead. And I know we're focusing here on the work that we do in Indigenous communities. And of course, Mark is doing that for his actual community. So, I know that it's easy for people to get discouraged when you think about your action not being enough by itself. But I want to encourage you to think outside of your own action. So if you've got that choice of using a straw or not using a straw, you might think, oh, gee, what difference does it make if I use a straw or not? Well, think about 7 billion people deciding not to use straws. You've got to be one of those 7 billion. So take those small opportunities where you can find them. And then take inspiration from the people you see around you who might be living their life in a way that you find inspirational, but maybe you think, oh, I could never do that. Well, let me put it to you as an analogy. Everything takes learning and everything takes practice. And you're not going to go from wanting to make change one day to suddenly being like the perfect hippie the next day where you're doing everything right. Just like a neurosurgeon doesn't operate on somebody's brain on her first day in medical school, right? So look to somebody for inspiration who's doing it the way you think things should be done, and just pick one thing. Pick one thing. Pick a meatless Monday, right? Pick growing some tomatoes on your balcony with your roommates and having a tomato salad that you grew yourself once a week. Pick not getting that brand new pair of jeans and instead going to the Goodwill. And you Gen Z folks, I've got a cousin who's 17, and my goodness, the outfits she puts together from the thrift store put me to shame. So do that, build your thrift store wardrobe and stop shopping at Old Navy, with that throwaway fast fashion. Just one thing. And you'll find that doing one thing, then the next thing gets easier, and then the next thing gets easier, and then the next thing gets easier. And the next thing you know, you'll be performing climate neurosurgery.
We only have a minute left, and I know Josh has to leave us. So I just wanted to know if there's any last words that Josh had for us before he left. And I can tell, because I've known her long enough, that Angie has a thought on the question just asked. But if she doesn't mind just sticking around for a few minutes to share it after Josh gives us any final thoughts.
Sure. I think we talk about climate change impacting all aspects of our lives, not just the physical environment around us, but our health, not just our physical health, but our spiritual or mental. And so, just try to do what you can to, I think if you come from a better place at it, you'll be able to make some of these changes more easily. They become less sacrifices. So something as simple as walking, to the store or walking somewhere instead of taking the car, you getting on your bike, that also is better for your health as well. And these things, and trying to be kinder. I think there's a lot of divisiveness going on around a lot of issues out in our world right now, but climate change is one of them. And, so we're trying to be more understanding, kinder, more patient, but, I guess my big thing would be to, get out, take care of your own body a bit more. You'll probably connect with the environment around you and feel more compassion for it and the people around you as well. But thank you so much for having me today and for putting together this great panel.
Thanks, Josh. Angie, did you want to give us any final thoughts?
I actually have to run too, but I will say on a different note, just to be fun and different. Yes, individual actions, and don't let the systems get off the hook. Yes, do your part, but you know what? There's a lot of folks that want you to believe that it's your responsibility. There are some big systems at play that need to change in order to really change the trajectory on a scale that matters. And so you'll find yourself someday in a job, whatever you're doing. Maybe you're a chef. Maybe you're going to change the way that the food is sourced in your food, in your culinary designs. Maybe you'll be in construction. Maybe you'll change the way the buildings are built so that they use less resources. Maybe you will be a doctor like Tristan, and you're going to help your patients. You're going to look ahead and know that what's coming, and you're going to try to help them with any illnesses that they have that result from climate change. So nobody is going to get away from this without looking at it, without considering the impacts of climate change on the work that they're going to do and on all of our lives. So I just, think you're going to end up incorporating it into your work because it's a reality that none of us can ignore.
Thank you, Angie. And then I think that's the point that Angie made, that we can't let systems off the hook, right? That we're part of a much larger system that is contributing to this, might give us an opportunity to get just some final thoughts from Tristan and some final thoughts from Mark as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the systems, the power systems at play here. I've been in school for quite some time now, as many of you have, and I don't quite remember learning about the power structures at play, when it comes to who is truly responsible for, the climate crisis, And so, for example, when it comes to the students, can you direct us in terms of where these power systems are? Who, like, for example, the city council, or or who controls the water? Who can we talk to really voice our concerns? You know what I'm saying, in terms of direction. Where can we go to really have our voice meet where the decisions are being made? Because that's hard to find out. And I just wanted to know from you guys, in terms of direction.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people, I remember going through this thing, thinking rationale when I was, fresh out of high school, I don't like something I see in government is, what can I do, right? Like, I'm just one person. I think a lot of people, don't realize how much strength they have. And I think a lot of people, once you get together with the same, belief in that, hey, we need to change the way we consider, our consumption of, fossil fuels or whatever, what have you, definitely contacting your city council, be registered to vote, write the letter, call them up and say, I don't agree with this. I'm a registered voter, and, I disagree with your stance on this policy. And, I unfortunately am going to have to vote against you because of your stance. And you may be one person, but everybody in that room is one person, but it doesn't count up to one. It counts up to however many people who feel the same way. So if you have 15, that's fine. Find another friend. If you have 15 people who find a friend who believe in you and are going to vote the same way, that's 30. They find a friend, that's 60. And before enough, and you have thousands of people who affect a change in policy. It doesn't have to be, something as large yet as, changing the entire country's policy, but you can start by changing that little corner of the world. If you're like, hey, I don't like offshore drilling, and you contact your congressman, you write them, you register to vote, you vote against them, whatever it have you do, you believe strongly enough, you can affect that change, because everybody has the right to vote in this country. Be registered and use that right. That is probably your strongest message of protest moving forward, is that ability to vote. And don't, be disheartened if it fails. That just means try harder. My tribe is a non-federally recognized tribe, not recognized by the United States government. Our people have been seeking federal recognition or some recognition from governments as a sovereign nation for almost 125 years. We didn't give up. We keep on going. That's the thing. You have to keep on going. If you want to see change happen, you have to make it happen. It's the easiest way to do.
And I just want to add to that, even though I know we're running a little bit late and I know students have classes and what have you to get to, but Mark is 100% correct. I gave you some easy, ideas for things you can do as an individual, but ultimately it is a systems level thing, and the change is going to have to come by making corporations and politicians bear the responsibility for where we are today. So yes, Mark, 100% on the voting. vote but also be looking a little bit beyond your own vote and at the systems that allow politicians who don't make the changes that we want to see occur. So for example, make sure that you advocate for, say, making a fix to the Citizens United decision that allows enormous corporations to donate money kind of secretly to people who will do the things that they want them to do that's to a benefit to that corporation. And I don't want to get too much into politics. It's my favorite subject and I could talk about it all day long. But Angie was right when she said that these powerful structures at the top are invested in making you feel like it's your responsibility. The reality is it's their responsibility. If we wanted to have an all-electric infrastructure, we should have, for cars, for example, we could have that by now, but there are very powerful interests who are trying to make sure that it doesn't happen. So we have the power of our vote. We also have the power of our pocketbook. So those are two ways to try to make larger systemic change that will help us fight this crisis.
Well, thank you guys for coming out here. We really appreciate your time. The students greatly appreciate your time and all that wisdom and information. And, just thank you tons. And we hope to see you again sometime in the future. We look forward to working with you and, thank you for everything.